So I'm going to start today not with my title slide, I guess. Yeah, there it is. Life and Times of a Mysterious Twin. Remember last night, whoops, I'm going to try and get this correct. We were looking at this slide with the sort of twinning of Clemens and Mark Twain. And what I want to say to begin with is that Samuel Langhorne Clemens was an unknown newspaper writer in Virginia City, Nevada, when he adopted that pen name of Mark Twain. He first used the name in February 1863 in a letter to the Virginia City Enterprise, his home newspaper. And he sent that letter from the capital city, Carson City. The letter is a hilarious report on the crazy doings of his friend and rival reporter, a man named Clement Rice. And he names Rice the Unreliable. I think that may be the name that Rob Fury has taken for me. The Unreliable is a fictionalized character who allows the narrator, Twain, to describe the comic words and actions in a kind of dramatic counterpoint. The narrator's always sober, well-behaved. The Unreliable is unreliable. So here's a bit of that first letter signed by Mark Twain. Here, the Unreliable crashes a fancy hotel party hosted by the former California Governor J. Neely Johnson, somewhat like our party we're going to have tonight in Morris House. About 9 o'clock, says Twain, the Unreliable came and asked Governor Johnson to let him stand on the porch. That creature has got more impudence than any person I ever saw in my life. Well, he stood and flattened his nose against the parlor window and looked hungry and vicious. He always looks that way. Until Colonel Musser arrived with some ladies, when he actually fell in their wake and came swaggering inside. First, he ate a platter of sandwiches. Then he ate a handsomely iced pound cake. Then he gobbled a dish of chicken salad. After that, he ate a roast pig, dishes of brandy grapes, jellies, and such things. Pyramids of fruits melted away before him as shadows fly at the sun's approach. So next to the Unreliable, Mark Twain sounds positively civil and polite. And in effect here, what Sam Clemens does is to create two twins in the letter. Clement Rice becomes twinned as the Unreliable, and Sam Clemens becomes twinned as Mark Twain. And for a whole nother year in the Nevada territory, these two writers, Clement Rice and Sam Clemens, continued to concoct stories about one another with the venues ranging from the two cities of Nevada to San Francisco. Later on, Samuel Clemens would claim that he confiscated the name Mark Twain from a legendary steamboat captain named Isaiah Sellers. But no scholar has ever found any writing by Sellers under that name. And in fact, the use of pen names, let's see him. See if I can give you him. There he is, about that time. The use of pen names was really a fashion in the 19th century in those middle years. Journalists regularly adopted pseudonyms, and often humorous ones. Stage performers were regularly named, really outrageous things like Petroleum v. Nasby, or maybe a more authentic sounding handle like Artemus Ward, a famous humorist of the day. So the private individual in those days remained anonymous, while a public figure would become famous or could become famous. So in Samuel Clemens' case, the figure of Mark Twain eventually became one of the most famous celebrities of 19th century America, and one could say of the English-speaking world, I would say. Perhaps the most. Mark Twain's celebrity started out local, and it grew to be global. From 1863 to 1866, he made a living as a freelance writer for Nevada and California newspapers and magazines. And some patterns in the life of Mark Twain as a writer and Samuel Clemens as a person were already apparent in these early years. Clemens enjoyed living in good hotels. He enjoyed having entertaining meals and drinking parties with his pals. He found himself regularly scrabbling for money and periodically in debt. At the same time, in November 1865, Mark Twain published a story which he called originally Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog. That first came out in the New York Saturday Press. The next month, Bret Harte reprinted that story but retitled it The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County and put that in his San Francisco magazine, The Californian. That story became an instant success, a silly tall tale in gold miner vernacular with just the right amount of humor. And it made Mark Twain a name. And over the next months, Sam Clemens wrote himself out of debt, published daily letters in the newspaper, the Virginia City Enterprise, was paid $100 a month for that work. He got a great travel gig, not as great as the one I just had, but pretty good. He got a job with the Sacramento Union, writing travel letters back to them. 25 letters he wrote from the Sandwich Islands, we now call Hawaii. And this went over a period of 4 months. Then he decided he would use this leverage to give himself a venue as a humorist. And so on the night of October 2nd, 1866, the humorist, the lecturer, Mark Twain, appeared before an audience of some 2,000 people in San Francisco, and he lectured on the Sandwich Islands. The handbill that he wrote himself for that performance says quite famously, and you'll remember this, I'll bet, "The trouble will begin at 8 o'clock." Well, the lecture was a hit, as Twain himself said, a great hit. From all contemporary accounts, Twain was a total innovator on stage. He spoke in a prolonged drawl, one that he would drop when he was in regular conversation with friends and family. He made fearless use of what we might call the pregnant pause, drawing out that silence to the very last moment, and then would release what he would call the snapper line of the story. He shambled around stage. I thought about, well, he wore loose, you saw me yesterday, he wore loose, unkempt clothes. I would look more like a Alaska miner, I guess. He also wore old-fashioned string ties, continually fiddled with his hair and this great walrus mustache, kept his hands in constant motion. The audiences loved him. Now, you may be thinking of the Hal Holbrook version of Twain, which, do you all remember that? I was a child, much younger than Rob. Yes, Mark Twain Tonight, we'll see it. But a later version, I saw it in 1966 on TV. That's much, much later of the Twain. This Twain that we're talking about was 31 years old. He had a mass of red hair. He had this big red walrus mustache. He was irreverent, sometimes coarse. He was extravagant and bold in his language. And he was a restless dynamo on the platform, always shifting tone, talking, moving with abandon. The other thing to say here is that San Francisco, when he hit it big like that, was the cultural capital of the West. But Sam Clemens knew that in order to make it, he was going to have to go to New York City and Boston, the two capitals of the publishing industry and of the cultural industry of the day. So he negotiated a deal with the newspaper Alta California in San Francisco. And the deal was that he would be a traveling correspondent and write travel letters back to San Francisco. So in January 1867, he arrives in New York. And over the next several months, Mark Twain sent a host of articles about New York City back to his California readers. He also published his first book, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County and Other Sketches. Probably a book that would be really fun to try to find a first edition of. In May 1867, known as the Wild Humorist of the Pacific Slope, Twain delivered a debut New York City lecture to a packed house of over 2,000 at the Great Hall of Cooper Union. And you may think of this because at Cooper Union, just less than 10 years earlier, Lincoln had delivered a magnificent speech. The audience of over 2,000, packed by people with complimentary tickets that Clemens had printed and distributed the day of the performance. It wasn't about the money, it was about the publicity. The lecture was so successful that he was asked to repeat the performance in Brooklyn and Irving Hall. And then, perhaps best of all, Clemens hit on yet another excellent travel gig. This time, he was going to travel with the celebrity preacher Henry Ward Beecher, who was organizing a cruise to Europe and the Holy Land. The Alta California advanced Clemens $1,200 to pay for the trip. And it led ultimately to his first really successful book, The Innocents Abroad, which was published in 1869. Well, this cruise lasted for 5 months, from June to November 1867. And in fact, as it turned out, it was going to be a celebrity cruise with Henry Ward Beecher and Tecumseh Sherman aboard. But Beecher backed out, even though he had organized the cruise. When he did, Sherman backed out. And then the congregation of Beecher's church began to back out rampantly. And they opened up the passenger list for all comers. And the passengers, ultimately 65 of them, turned out to be a lot older and a lot more pious than Clemens had bargained for. They were also much broader and more representative of American middle-class people, and were from places upstate New York, where my wife is from, Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, New Orleans, San Francisco. They were not the sort of folks that Sam Clemens would really tend to enjoy entertaining, but they were exactly the kind of people or characters that Mark Twain could use for satirical purposes. So he found some congenial friends on this trip, a group of about 7 or 8 men who became a circle of cronies, pals, that he would take excursions with to Tangiers, Paris, Rome along the way. They were aboard the ship, the Quaker City, and they stopped in a variety of places. They stopped in Greece, they stopped in Yalta, where they met the Tsar of Russia. They stopped in Constantinople. These pilgrims, especially the cronies that were traveling, he called them the pilgrims. There were 7 or 8 of them. They traveled to Beirut, Damascus, Jerusalem, and beyond. And that trip really made Twain a double success. He became, through those travel letters, a really well-known travel writer and lecturer. And then, second of all, it was a success for Sam Clemens. One of the passengers on the Quaker City was a young man, a callow youth, sent to get some culture by his father, a man named Charles Langdon. And he became a friend of Sam Clemens. And when they returned to New York City from their 5-month cruise, Charles Langdon invited Sam Clemens to a family dinner, and Clemens met a woman named Olivia Langdon, usually known as Livy. And the Langdons, by the way, were a pretty wealthy family, in fact, not pretty wealthy, quite wealthy family from Elmira, New York. They had businesses in timber and coal. So over the next couple of years after the trip, those two twin successes developed in parallel. Mark Twain spent much of 1868 on the road. He was lecturing nonstop across the country about his travels. He was working feverishly on this book that would become The Innocents Abroad. And meanwhile, Sam Clemens was courting Livy Langdon. He visited the Langdon home in Elmira, New York. He proposed to Olivia Langdon twice. The two would eventually marry in February 1870, even though Livy's father made inquiries into Sam Clemens' character since they didn't know anything about him, really. And on two separate occasions, Twain provided his father-in-law, his future father-in-law, with lists of people for references. And in both cases, the letters came back about Sam Clemens' persistent bad behavior in Nevada and California. These reports were from people that Clemens had recommended to his father-in-law. But somehow or other, Mr. Langdon had his own opinion about this young man, and it was clearly positive. He backed his efforts to marry Livy. He backed his efforts to find a steady income. He bought an interest in a newspaper, the Buffalo Express, so that Clemens could have a job, and he provided them, the young couple, with a house and servants. So that's quite a father-in-law to have. In August 1869, while Sam Clemens was having that success, Mark Twain published The Innocents Abroad to much acclaim and to good sales. And one of the most important reviews, interestingly, was from a young man, William Dean Howells. Howells was a young associate editor at the Atlantic Monthly. Some of you may have actually read some of his fiction in your lives. I used to teach it occasionally, The Rise of Silas Lapham, or A Modern Instance, Hazards of Good Fortune, those kinds of novels. He became a really close friend of Clemens, a lifelong friend, probably his best and most steady supporter. Their friendship would last for over 40 years. So even though Sam Clemens maintained an office at the Buffalo newspaper, his heart was not really in it. And eventually he sold that interest in the newspaper. He sold the Buffalo house for a loss. In August 1870, Livy's father died horribly of stomach cancer and left Livy with a substantial inheritance. She had a son, Langdon, in November 1870. Her health was always quite precarious. She was both very strong but also very fragile. Langdon's premature birth was precarious. In the fall of 1871, with all of this turmoil taking place, the death in the family, the birth of this premature baby, they moved to Hartford, Connecticut, and start leasing a home in a wealthy neighborhood that's called Nook Farm. So when you read about Twain and you say Nook Farm, it sounds like they're on this farm, but they're actually in this beautiful neighborhood in Hartford. In March 1872, Livy gave birth to the first of 3 daughters, Susie, who was really the apple of Twain's eye, of Sam Clemens' eye. But that same year, just 2 months later, June 1872, Langdon died of diphtheria. He wasn't 2 years old yet. So a lot of upheaval in this family. But Mark Twain's writing was going extremely well at the same time. and he was lecturing widely. You might, wildly too, you might say relentlessly. He was going across the Northeast, across the Midwest, from Boston to Chicago, working hard on his second book of nonfiction about the Nevada days and the Hawaii trip called Roughing It, one of my favorite of his books, published in February 1872. He was also publishing a monthly humor column in Galaxy magazine, which was a new literary magazine out of New York City in the later 1860s. He even invented and patented a Mark Twain's self-pasting scrapbook, one of his most lucrative business ventures. And let me move us towards that. So here's Mark Twain's patent scrapbook advertisement. It's an excellent way to appreciate how Sam Clemens used Mark Twain as a marketing tool. During his travels to the Sandwich Islands, to Europe, and to the Middle East, Clemens had become interested in scrapbooks because he kept asking his family and friends to keep the newspaper clippings reporting on his lectures and his travel letters. And along the way towards writing The Innocents Abroad, Clemens lost several of the manuscripts of his letters. So he had to ask correspondents for any copies they might have of newspaper clippings that they might have about his travels and about his writing. So this led him to this idea of a self-pasting scrapbook, which would make collecting clippings and other memorabilia like photographs or cards very convenient and orderly. What is that thing that people do nowadays that's like that? People will teach you how to keep scrapbooks and so forth. That's a thing. So in addition, of course, the scrapbook is a way of advertising Mark Twain himself as an author and a celebrity. So this copy of the scrapbook at the University of Virginia has a certificate that handwritten by Twain, and it's made out to Sloat, Woodman and Company. They were the people who were, his old friend Daniel Sloat was one of the pilgrims on the Quaker City trip. And they were marketing this scrapbook in the 1870s. And I'd want to read this certificate aloud to you while you look at it on the screen. Messrs. Sloat, Woodman and Company, I hereby certify that during many years I was afflicted with cramps in my limbs, indigestion, salt rheum, enlargement of the liver, and periodical attacks of inflammatory rheumatism complicated with St. Vitus dance. My sufferings being so great that for months at a time I was unable to stand upon my feet without assistance or speak the truth with it. But as soon as I had invented my self-pasting scrapbook and begun to use it in my own family, all these infirmities disappeared. In disseminating this universal healer among the world's afflicted, you are doing a noble work, and I sincerely hope you will get your reward, partly in the sweet consciousness of doing good, but the bulk of it in cash. Very truly yours, always. Very truly yours, Mark Twain. Well, the scrapbook was sold by traveling salespeople and in stationery stores and advertised in magazines and in these 4-page pamphlets. So this is the pamphlet form. And then the next one, the next slide, shows the kind of different bindings that the scrapbook was available for sale. Leather, cloth, sizes. So you can imagine these people in small towns and villages across the U.S. who would be given the opportunity to order Mark Twain's self-pasting scrapbook. And in addition, I should say, they were also being given the opportunity to order his books. Mark Twain's books were, during his whole career, were nearly always a financial success. They were always in print. And for the first 25 years of his career, he published his books with a company from Hartford called the American Publishing Company. And then he switched from that company, run by a man named Elisha Bliss, he switched from American Publishing Company to his own publishing company called Charles Webster and Company. And Webster was a relative of his, an in-law kind of relative of his. They were both subscription companies. This is really an interesting phenomenon. His books were sold exclusively by subscription, which is that they were not available as trade editions in bookstores to begin with. Instead, salespeople who were called canvassing agents went door to door showing prospective buyers things like the scrapbook here, different samples of what the book would look like. Illustrations, options for binding, options for cover, and many of those agents, by the way, were women. The price of the books, the elegant bindings, was as much as 3 times the normal price that would be the case in bookstores in trade editions. So, in short, there's a lot to say about the subscription publishing system, but in short, it worked directly with the traveling sales system for the scrapbook and other items. So you can imagine that things just build upon themselves. In the 1870s and 1880s, Mark Twain became wealthy, significantly wealthy, as a subscription author and publisher. So the scrapbook is a cute beginning of this, but I've got to tell you, it's one of the best things he ever made as far as success. It remained for sale well into the 20th century. The subscription publishing system meant that Twain was a popular writer and a household name. It meant that the number of copies of a book would be printed to suit the orders already given, already sold. So there was never any worry about copies sitting in a warehouse somewhere. I'll tell you the story of my first 2 books from Penn State Press and what they asked me to do with the warehouse copies. The subscription system had 2 other major effects on Twain as a writer. First, the subscription publishers would advertise their books as hefty volumes, deserving a luxury leather cover or binding, and as a statement of intellectual and artistic heft in the parlor of a family. And this meant that Twain would write his books with a certain number of pages in mind. He would fill the book to fit the requirements of the sales. Second, the subscription system encouraged his tendencies to write in episodes and to digress freely. The plan of a book was always linear and sequential, especially in the travel narratives that he began his career with. So episode would follow episode. In The Innocents Abroad, for instance, he pokes fun at a fellow passenger he calls the Oracle, because the Oracle is always summarizing and mangling the accounts he reads in tour guidebooks. He's a lot like the Unreliable. But Twain himself uses guidebooks and uses histories to flesh out his own narrative with entertaining facts and stories. So I'm suggesting that it's not just the story of the travel that is taking place, it's also, oh, I need more pages. So he'll fill it out. In Roughing It, similarly, Twain visits Salt Lake City, Utah. Well, he fills that out by giving us 4 chapters and 2 appendices of Mormon history. He reproduces several Mormon narratives, other documents in his text. He quotes the sources at length, throws in an occasional ironic comment to undercut the authenticity or authority of his materials. One chapter begins, "It's a luscious country for thrilling evening stories about assassinations of intractable Gentiles." Twain did not single-handedly turn the subscription publishing system into a lucrative business, but he was without doubt the most successful subscription author and publisher in American history. Elisha Bliss's American Publishing Company brought out the first novel ever published by subscription, The Gilded Age, 1873. Twain wrote that book with his Hartford neighbor, Charles Dudley Warner. It became a financial literary success. It sold over 50,000 copies its first year. It even gave a name to the era of post-Civil War America that we are looking at from the 1870s through to the 1890s, the time of the Grant administration, the time of Reconstruction, of Ku Klux Klan, of mass expansion of railroads, of mining interests, of industrialization and mechanization on a new corporate scale. During those same 3 decades, 1870, 1880, 1890, Mark Twain was publishing a book every 2 years. He wrote plays, short stories, novels, travel narratives, sketches. Check him out. That's him a little later. The novels, and he was publishing in all the major magazines in the country. The novels were regularly published in serial form in places like Harper's, The Atlantic, the Century magazine. Century magazine was the New Yorker of the day. He was sought after for after-dinner speeches and lectures, for comments, for witticisms. His production was amazing in daily episodes of 8, 9 hours of writing. Pages produced, which he would write letter upon letter to correspondents, bragging about how many pages he had written. Sam Clemens was also busy. The family moved into a palatial home in Nook Farm neighborhood of Hartford in late 1874, just before their second daughter, Clara, was born. They had 7 servants, including nurses for each of their girls. They lived like wealthy one-percenters. They regularly summered at Livy's adopted sister's Quarry Farm property near Elmira, New York. And Twain often spent time in New York City and Boston. He was wealthy, a wealthy writer. Livy Clemens was an heiress. Yes, they were wealthy. When they traveled to Europe and England, 1878, 1879, they went first class. They carried along an entourage of servants, baggage. In 1876, 1878, Clemens traveled to Bermuda and to Europe with his friend Joseph Twitchell. They did a European walking tour, but in this case, they went by rail, carriage, boat, and it became the basis for his third travel book, A Tramp Abroad. But the biggest discovery, and this goes back to what Mark Connor was telling us last night, I think the biggest discovery of the 1870s for Twain was the Mississippi River, to return to that country and to his past as a steamboat pilot right on the eve of the Civil War. William Dean Howells persuaded Twain to write a series of articles about his old times on the Mississippi for the Atlantic Monthly, or the Atlantic. And he whipped them out quickly in the last months of 1874. He was just nearing that age of about 39 years old. The essays were published for the first 6 months of 1875. They were great narratives and descriptions and a source of inspiration for Twain himself. He realized what he had on his hands there. He had already begun writing The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and those articles inspired him to begin working on what he called the River Book. And that would ultimately become Life on the Mississippi. So we can certainly say that Howells and the assignment of those articles led him toward his masterpiece, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and even toward that odd twin novel that we call Pudd'nhead Wilson. So the years between The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in 1876 and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in 1885, near decade there, this was an amazing mixture of success and failure for Mark Twain and Sam Clemens. Mark Twain was clearly at the height of his powers as a writer. In addition to those 2 novels, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, he published A Tramp Abroad in 1880, The Prince and the Pauper in 1882, another twin story, Life on the Mississippi in 1883. He had 2 different plays produced and staged repeatedly. One of them, called Colonel Sellers, based on the Gilded Age, made him over $70,000 during the decade. I can't translate that into present terms for you right away. He was so successful as a playwright that he was thinking about not writing books anymore and just writing plays. Well, fortunately, he had this awful collaboration with Bret Hart on a play about comical Chinese people. Well, that convinced him otherwise. Meanwhile, for the Clemens, Livy Clemens gave birth to a third daughter, Jean, in July 1880. So, the Clemens family, now numbering 5, lived lavishly in a Hartford mansion. Their furniture, draperies, statuary, paintings, all of their appointments of this house were imported from numerous European trips. And underwriting all of this wealth and all of this luxurious living was the genius of Samuel Clemens' twin, Mark Twain. Well, Sam Clemens and Mark Twain are almost identical twins, of course, and they're most nearly identical in their ability to put time, energy, and money into big, bad business ideas. As the 1880s began, Mark Twain was a celebrity writer. Sam Clemens was a wealthy businessman. Clemens was constantly on the lookout for a new invention, something like his self-pasting scrapbook, but bigger, more important. He was searching for a technological bonanza, and he was in fact personifying the Gilded Age that he had named. While the term already had pejorative connotations when it was coined, it also described the new industries and inventions of this expanding American economy. You might think of it as also the age of engineers or the age of systems, with railroads leading to finance, management, transportation, and urbanization, all kinds of innovations. Henry Adams observed the new railroad system required the energies of a generation, for it required all the new machinery to be created: capital, banks, mines, furnaces, shops, powerhouses, technical knowledge, mechanical population, together with a steady remodeling of social and political habits, ideas, institutions fit the new scale and suit the new conditions. The generation between 1865 and 1895 was mortgaged to the railways, and no one knew it better than that generation itself. So this was the age of the Gilded Age. This was the age you might think of with Carnegie, Edison, Westinghouse, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Frick, Rogers, Ford, Mellon, Morgan, Guggenheim, Stanford, Huntington, robber barons, or captains of industry. Note how many of our museums and libraries are named after these men. So Mark Twain was part of this revolutionary new generation of big business, and he responded to it with enthusiasm. The real story, there are a lot of parts to it, but the focus story I have to go to is he became focused on the work of a local Hartford inventor named James Page, and Page was inventing an automatic typesetting machine, one that would revolutionize the process of putting together newspapers, magazines, and books. At first, Clemens thought this was impossible, but then at the same time he bought $5,000 worth of stock in the Page typesetter before he ever saw it work at all. He recalled in his autobiography many years later, "It is here that the music begins." Ultimately, to cut to the chase, Sam Clemens invested close to $200,000 in the Page typesetter. The machine never worked properly for longer than a few hours. He put thousands of more dollars into other printing ventures and into the subscription publishing business that he was running. And although he was the most successful subscription author in America, Mark Twain, never satisfied with the sales of the American Publishing Company or his other company, Osgood, so he formed his own company, and ultimately that company was Mark Twain. 2 books that we have to say were published by Twain's own Charles Webster Company, bestsellers, landmarks in American literature. We've got to name them. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, February 1885, immediately sold 40,000 copies. Now, more than 20 million copies have been sold. And then maybe more impressive because it was such a great idea on Twain's part, and he had so many bad ideas. He landed U.S. Grant as an author, offering this impoverished former president a generous contract for publishing his memoirs. Grant worked tirelessly on this book because he knew he was dying of throat cancer, and his family was depending on this book to survive. Grant, finished in the summer of 1885. Volume 1, Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, appeared in December. Ultimately, that book earned his widow, Julia Grant, $450,000. And Twain claimed that it netted him $200,000. So the other thing that one netted was, are we almost done?
No, but Jim, to help us understand the figures, you mentioned
Yeah, I'm sorry I can't.
But I can tell you what it is.
Okay.
$80,000 in 1880 is just under $2 million in today's terms.
Great, thank you. So we're talking about a $10 million bestseller for the widow, Julia Grant. Wow, excellent. Thank you, Rob. Then just real quickly, not only was he so successful with these two books and as a publisher and writer, Twain was also appearing as a lecturer. And he went around with the Louisiana Creole writer George Washington Cable in 1884, 1885. It was called the Twins of Genius Tour. Lovely. Those twin geniuses traveled to 80 cities in those winter months. And meanwhile, Century Magazine was publishing the first excerpts of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The celebrity was just incredible at this time for Twain. And celebrity breeds celebrity. Lectures increased book sales and magazine sales, and magazines and books increased audiences at the lectures, and it just goes and goes like that, a feedback loop. In April 1885, James Page announces the perfection of his automatic typesetting machine. Clemens enthusiastically formed a company to begin looking for investors and to market the machine. Webster and Company, flourishing at first with Huckleberry Finn and U.S. Grant. As the Page typesetting machine goes its inevitable descent into bankruptcy, so the subscription company Charles Webster and Company goes towards bankruptcy. It is true that Twain had some really poor ideas for titles in his publishing company. He also had some great ideas, multi-volume works, but then people would only buy a couple of the volumes and then stop paying. So every ounce of gold created by the Webster Company subscription publishing system went into the Page typesetter. By the summer of 1893, Webster and Company owed Sam Clemens and Livy Clemens nearly $200,000, so a couple of $1 million, and loans of over $100,000 to Mount Morris Bank in New Jersey. The Page Company was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. It owed large sums of money to investors in Chicago. In April 1894, Webster and Company liquefied. By December, Page Compositor Manufacturing Company dissolved. In total, Samuel Clemens lost somewhere between $170,000 and $300,000, somewhere around $3 to $5 million in today's money. He was saved from utter ruin by an industrialist friend of his, H.H. Rogers. Rogers took over Clemens' financial troubles, managed to whittle that debt down to a mere, Rob, $80,000. So $1 million? $2 million. The arrangement put all of Mark Twain's copyrights in the hands of his wife, Livy Clemens. The family took it on themselves to make other arrangements. There was a headline at one point, Mark Twain bankrupt. By that time, the whole family had moved to Europe, where they lived from 1891 on in order to, isn't this interesting, to be economical and frugal. His daughters Susie and Jean lived with relatives in Elmira. They weren't really destitute for, people who owed millions of dollars. The family still had Livy's income from her inheritance. They still had income from Twain's backlist and occasional scrapbook. They had income from magazines and journal articles, but they couldn't afford to live in their Hartford mansion, and they last visited that mansion in March 1895. He hit upon a scheme for working his way out of debt. He would make a huge lecture tour around the English-speaking world. He would travel the globe, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Southern Africa, Great Britain. It ran for a full year, from July 1895 to July 1896. He went with Livy and with the second daughter, Clara, and the three of them were always accompanied by a lecture agent and other companions. They always traveled first class while he was earning his way out of debt. In several places, several parts of the tour, he recorded really no profit to speak of, but he did send home money constantly to H.H. Rogers. And a year after the tour, he published a travel book, Following the Equator, and was paid $10,000 as an advance for that book and for magazine publications by Harper's. So ultimately, to cut to the chase on Twain and bankruptcy, by March 1898, Rogers had negotiated the final payment of all of Samuel Clemens' debts. Now, he didn't pay it 100%, but he did pay a lot of it. This, by the way, that you're looking at is a picture of him from Australia from a photography studio and was used as a publicity photograph for some of his lectures on that world tour. I want to mention two novels from this period. In 1889, he published A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. The main characters, I'm going to return to them even though I didn't make you read it. I'm going to return to them later this week. The Yankee, Hank Morgan, is a foreman in a Connecticut factory, and then of course the other main character is King Arthur of Camelot. This time travel fantasy brings all of the material progress and middle-brow culture of 19th century America to the world of medieval England. Abby Montgomery notwithstanding, middle-brow culture means knights learning to ride bicycles and play baseball. Merlin, completely overtopped in wizardry by Hank Morgan's fireworks. Like a pair of twins or twinned opposites, the King and Morgan go on an odyssey through England pretending to be commoners. The horrors of medieval life and of serfdom are made abundantly clear to both of them. And then, amazingly, with all of this material progress through and laughing at the medieval age, the novel ends in an apocalyptic war. Hank Morgan against the Knights of the Round Table and their allies. Gatling guns, bombs, trenches filled with fire lead to the wholesale destruction of the world of King Arthur. Morgan is assassinated, but reawakens in 19th century Connecticut as if the entire novel has been a dream. Or was it a nightmare? The second novel, which we have read, Pudd'nhead Wilson, published in 1894, just before Twain declares bankruptcy and begins that world lecture tour. It returns Twain to the world of the Mississippi River before the Civil War. That's a return to the world of African American slavery, systemic and legal racism. There's a great deal of humor in that novel, I think, and we'll see this in a couple of days during our discussions. But the events of that book focus most especially on the effects of social conventions and assumptions on human character. We're constantly being formed and deformed by those around us and by the unspoken laws of the world we inhabit. Character is not so much born in that novel as made. The twins in Pudd'nhead Wilson and in the twin novel, Those Extraordinary Twins, reach far into Twain's late dark vision of humankind. These images of the last years, just to see those areas he wrote a history of Joan of Arc, and there she is presenting him with a laurel wreath at a dinner party in New York City. Sam Clemens' losses, as you know, became deeper and deeper, much deeper than mere dollars. And Mark Twain continued to enjoy great fame and popularity, even as his vision darkened even more than what we experience in Pudd'nhead Wilson. When the three members of the Clemens family arrived in England at the end of July 1896 after their world tour, they immediately telegraphed the two daughters, Susie and Jean, who were still in Elmira, New York. They asked them to book passage immediately for England so that the five family members would be able to spend the summer and fall together before heading to the continent. They still imagined that it was much cheaper to live in Europe, and maybe it was. But then they also learned at that point that Susie had fallen ill, though the telegrams kept reassuring the Clemens that she was going to be fine. Livy and Clara booked passage and sailed at once for America to find Susie and Jean. Sam Clemens stayed in England, lecturing as Mark Twain and begin working on Following the Equator, that travel book. August 15th, Susie Clemens dies of spinal meningitis. Clemens learned of her death by telegram. Clara and Livy got the news while they were aboard the steamer on the way to the United States. Two more losses follow. After a lifetime of managing difficult health problems, repeated illnesses, and yet being a very, very strong person, Livy Clemens dies in June 1901 in Florence, Italy, 57 years old. In December 1909, Jean, the youngest, who had always had some mental problems and difficulties, she died from heart failure while having an epileptic seizure in the bathtub. Clara Clemens, the middle daughter, was the only surviving member of the family, the only member of the family to survive her father. Clemens spent the first 3 months of 1910 in Bermuda, returned to a villa in Redding, Connecticut, Stormfield, which he had built late in life. And at the very end, Clara was with him, holding his hand and hearing his very last words, goodbye. That's it. So Rob, do we have time for questions?
15 minutes.
What is a self-pasting scrapbook? Was the page?
It had this. It had some mucilage, glue-ish stuff on the page, and a kind of cellophane cover.
Okay.
So he was way on
ahead.
top of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anybody remember what they call that nowadays? Scrapbooking. Yeah. Yeah, that's
It's been
it.
replaced by Instagram.
Thank you. I was replaced by Twitter.
You said that he had.
Yes, sir.
You said that he had obviously a pseudonym, Mark Twain. But did anybody try to hide the real name in those days, or was it? Why did they choose
A pseudonym. That's a good question.
That was my question. Why do you think?
Why the pseudonym?
Why do you think, right?
Yeah. That's a very good question, isn't it? Why pseudonyms? Well, I think there was a real desire to hide one's private life and to be able to live the life. Clemens is such a bad example of this, isn't he? Because he's so celebrated that he has no privacy except inside the house with his family. But there were the many other examples. Think of our modern day people. It would be as if Steve. We found out that Bob Dylan is not really Bob Dylan. You know, what's his name?
Zimmerman.
Zimmerman. Yeah, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question of why the pseudonyms. Abby?
This is a related bit off the wall question. Do we know if he ever published any under any other names, or is there any?
He did to start with, yes, and he used different, as he called the Unreliable or the Oracle. He used early on in his journalism career, yes, in Nevada. He used other pen names, and then hit upon Mark Twain in 1860. What did I say? The quiz. 3? Yes. Yes, sir.
Oh, me?
You.
The dialects in both Pudd'nhead Wilson and in Huck Finn, he must have been a pretty good listener, because I can't think the average person.
I used to, when I was teaching Huck Finn back in the day, I used to claim that notice, we'll talk about it again on Wednesday, I guess, but I used to claim that, that was such a lie. But they have actually come around, and scholars have said that, yes, in fact, he's very good at these different dialects of the Missouri dialects along the river. And, I've got to believe that he's also very, very good in Pudd'nhead Wilson at hearing those sounds. So, yeah, I think a lot of writers are very good listeners, are very good hearers of voices, and catch those, and catch turns of phrase as well. One that I love that Twain uses repeatedly in some of his early writings as well, like Roughing It and The Innocents Abroad, is the word smooch, to steal. And he loves to use that word. Well, where did that come from, right? So it's just a piece of vernacular that he adores and wants to employ. So hard.
Even though he used Mark Twain as a pseudonym, he never hid Samuel Clemens. And some of the illustrations you have show Samuel Clemens parenthesis Mark Twain in his own handwriting.
Yes.
So, and I think most people who grow up now and read Mark Twain know Samuel Clemens is his real name. It's not hidden.
That's right. It's not a hidden pseudonym at all in this case. That's right. They were originally, weren't they? And then you look back in the 18th century at women writers who adopted male pseudonyms, right, in order to get published. Charlotte Bronte was Currer Bell, that kind of thing. George Eliot, Martha Evans.
Do we know? Tell me about his education. What was his background?
Whose background?
Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. What was his?
You mean how he grew up? Since I sort of picked him up, in Nevada, right? So born in Florida, Missouri, his father was a business person, but also a legal person who ultimately was a judge. I love the fact that he always is using judges as the judge is right, that kind of thing. And like his son, not a particularly wise businessman. One of the interesting things about the family is they owned some land in Tennessee that was their constant, let's sell the land in Tennessee, we'll be rich. Don't know exactly what ever happened to that idea or that land. So he grew up in Missouri, and we'll hear some of his checkered past from Fran McDonald, I think, the Confederate irregular. And then the other part of it that we're also going to talk about, I think, with Michael Hill and Mark Connor is that Twain makes quite a journey in terms of his racial attitudes. So he starts out as, I won't say he was exactly a Confederate, but he was a Southerner who was used to a distinction, racial distinction. And we still see some of that, of course, in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Pudd'nhead Wilson. And yet, that Twain who's treating those days is clearly not in favor of them and doesn't believe in them. So it's interesting the sort of path he takes out of his background. So yeah, and his brother Orion is the one who gets him to Nevada during the Civil War. It's an escape from Missouri, an escape from his desertion. He had deserted the irregular army in Missouri. So he was, he could have been, I guess, summarily executed for desertion, but he escapes and gets to Nevada with his brother and then tries to be a silver prospector and doesn't do very well at it. And it's hard work. And then decided writing and talking was a lot better.
So as a celebrity, a true celebrity, I was always thinking like Babe Ruth was the first American celebrity. Is maybe Mark Twain the first?
Oh, I'd put Twain before Babe Ruth, I would. I think you're right about maybe Babe Ruth, but prize fighting was such a sport, that I'm thinking even in the 1880s and 90s before Babe Ruth, for us in the 21st century, baseball is probably a great place to go, and Babe Ruth is a great name to call for that kind of celebrity, sports celebrity. But I think prize fighters would have been
John L.
Sullivan is one.
Jake Kilrain.
Jack Johnson is another.
Great player.
That's right. So Jim Thorpe.
But for traveling writers who would give presentations at clubs, etc., of course there's the precedent of Charles Dickens in American life. Yes, so that may have inspired.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's a great point.
In the days before television and radio, people had nothing to do at night as good as going to a lecture.
Thank you. The lecture series starts in the 1820s and 1830s, is a winter entertainment, not entertainment, it's high-minded. It gets started in New England. And your people like Emerson, Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass are all like stars of the lecture circuit, the Lyceum circuit. But then by the time Twain comes along, the lecture system is huge. And what he does in there, and he's not the inventor of this by any means, he is exploiting this idea of entertainment, of humor, rather than high-minded knowledge, diffusion of knowledge or something. And so the travel lecture is one that combines a sense of, gosh, isn't it fun to find out about those Sandwich Islands? Or, did you know that Damascus is one of the oldest cities in the world? That kind of thing. And fun with, watch the pilgrims on donkeys, and riding through the streets of Beirut, that kind of thing. So he's a master at these combinations. And I want to say that he alters that sense of the lecture, of the winter lecture series. And he turns it into the kind of performance that we think of as stand-up comedy nowadays.
Was it?
Sorry, let's go over.
I looked up the meaning of Mark Twain. It was a Mississippi River term, and it means safe depth for a steamboat. It's actually a measurement of depth.
2 fathoms depth. So Mark, what depth? Twain, 2 fathoms. That kind of thing. That's exactly right.
Was he ever part of the Chautauqua circuit?
Chautauqua was, I don't know about that. That's a good question. Chautauqua was originally in upstate New York, very high-minded. And I just want to give one shout out. Have any of you seen The Ballad of Buster Scruggs? The new, it's on Netflix. It's the Coen brothers' new anthology of Wild West. The last one is called The Immortal Remains. And a group of people, of strangers, are on a stagecoach out west in the dark, and one of the passengers is a lady whose husband is a Chautauqua lecturer. And she is so excited to be reunited with him after 3 years' absence from one another. And I won't go any farther. If you can, you've got to see that. The Coen brothers are, so brilliant. And this Ballad of Buster Scruggs.
Jim, Huckleberry Finn reads like a serial. Was it in fact first published in serial form?
Yes, I mentioned that Harper's, I think it is. Maybe I get this wrong in my from what I actually said, but yes, it was in installments to begin with, and then, but not fully, not the whole book. Something like 5 installments or 6 installments came out. This is a tease, of course. The New Yorker does this really well. They'll give you parts of a novel or a short story by a great new young novelist, and that's, you go, oh, Sally Rooney, I remember that name, and you go, oh, I read a story by her 2 months ago in the New Yorker, and now here's her great new novel being reviewed in the New York Review of Books. Oh gosh, boom, so that they are so. We think big oil has got its pockets and everything, and they do, but the publishing industry, man, wow, those people are wily, and Twain was right in there.
Did he leave any estate?
Oh yeah, and part of that estate. I mean, I've visited Stormfield in Reading, Italian villa, beautiful, and it's part of the Mark Twain estate. Yes, so that bankrupt, he came out okay, and Clara married. And she was a professional musician, a singer, and married a professional musician. Don't know exactly what her fate was, but
Did she have any children?
I don't know about that. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if there are any descendants, Not sure. Anybody know that? I don't. Whether there are any Twain descendants?
She lived a really long time.
And wrote about her dad. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?